One declassified CIA history says secret U-2 and OXCART flights generated more than half of UFO reports in key Cold War years. 3 claim sits on page 73 of an official CIA history staff monograph about overhead reconnaissance. The book is not a UFO study. It is a program history of the aircraft, development, politics, operations, and intelligence purpose. That makes the UFO passage unusually incidental rather than promotional. It is only a few sentences in a 272-page history, but it changes the way one part of the UFO record has to be read. The authors say, Air Force investigators regularly contacted the CIA project staff in Washington, compared reported sightings with secret U-2 flight logs, and eliminated a majority of those reports. The public could not be told what the investigators had actually found. That distinction matters. A person could report something genuinely unidentified, Blue Book could privately identify it, and the official answer could still remain vague or misleading because the aircraft itself was classified. The document does not say every UFO report was a spy plane. It does not say the unresolved cases were secretly U-2s. It makes a narrower claim about a large share of reports during the late 1950s and much of the 1960s, first involving the U-2 and later OXCART. To understand why that claim is plausible, go back to 1954. The United States wanted intelligence over the Soviet Union without sending a conventional bomber into defended airspace. The CIA and Lockheed began developing a light reconnaissance aircraft that would fly at heights most people did not think a manned airplane could reach. The strategic pressure was real. Washington had major gaps in its knowledge of Soviet bomber bases, missiles, nuclear facilities, and industrial capacity. A reconnaissance aircraft able to photograph those targets from extreme altitude promised something satellites could not yet provide. The same feature that made the aircraft valuable to intelligence, however, also made it visually abnormal to anyone who happened to look up. By August 1955, that aircraft was being tested at Groom Lake in Nevada. The early U-2s were silver. Commercial airliners typically cruised around 10,000 to 20,000 feet, while military aircraft such as the B-47 generally operated below 40,000. The U-2 was climbing above 60,000 feet. For pilots and controllers looking up from the normal aviation world, the sky had acquired an object that did not fit the known performance envelope. The classified aircraft existed before the public explanation for it could exist. That is the mechanism this documentary follows for 20 years of the CIA reconnaissance record. Not secrecy as a vague excuse, but secrecy connected to hardware, flight logs, specific altitudes, official investigators, and a wreck that still leaves a boundary around what it can explain. The U-2 looked impossible because in practical terms it was flying in a different sky. A person on the ground sees sunset when the sun drops below the local horizon. A pilot at 20,000 feet sees it later because the horizon is farther away. A U-2 above 60,000 feet can still be illuminated after the landscape, and a lower aircraft are already in darkness. CIA history describes the result in very concrete terms. An airline crew flying in the early evening could be in shadow while a silver U-2 far above still caught direct sunlight. Picture the geometry over the western United States in 1955. An airliner is moving east to west at roughly one-third the U-2's altitude. The cockpit has entered dusk. Above it, a small bright point appears where no ordinary aircraft is expected to be. The object may glint, brighten, fade, and appear fiery as its angle to the sun changes. There is no contrail or familiar shape that the observer can resolve at that distance. The observer is not necessarily careless. The observation can be accurate while the interpretation remains open. CIA historians Gregory Pedlow and Donald Velzenbach wrote that this effect produced an unexpected increase in UFO reports. Their account is unusually useful because it explains both the visual stimulus and the institutional response. Airline pilots reported sightings to air traffic controllers. Pilots and ground observers also wrote to the Air Force unit responsible for investigating unidentified objects. The U-2 itself had been designed around secrecy. Its first operations were meant to photograph areas the United States could not inspect from the ground. CIA museum material says the aircraft could fly around 70,000 feet and had a range of about 2,950 miles. Its cameras could resolve objects on the ground only a few feet across from more than 12 miles above the Earth. Those numbers were extraordinary in the mid-1950s. The pilot was operating in a pressure suit with a machine built around a narrow, high-altitude performance envelope, while people below were judging it with experience drawn from ordinary traffic. A public observer had no normal reference for what was overhead. On July 5, 1956, early U-2 overflights of the Soviet Union were already producing strategic intelligence. By then, the aircraft had moved from experimental curiosity to an operational system whose existence had to be protected. That security requirement did not stop at the edge of a base. It followed the airplane into any civilian sky from which it could be seen. There was another If the Air Force publicly admitted that a strange high-altitude sighting was an American reconnaissance aircraft, it could reveal when the aircraft flew, where it flew, and what performance it had. A correct UFO explanation could become an intelligence leak. This is why the U-2 matters to the UFO history, even if a viewer has no interest in alien claims. It shows that identification and disclosure are separate acts. An investigator may know the likely identity of an object and still be prevented from stating it. By the end of the decade, that gap between private identification and public explanation had become part of the Blue Book process itself. The reports rose because the aircraft moved beyond the altitude assumptions built into ordinary aviation. 5. The official history gives a simple ladder of numbers. Mid-1950s airliners commonly operated between 10,000 and 20,000 feet. B-47 bombers and other military aircraft generally stayed below 40,000. U-2 test flights went above 60,000. CIA material later described operational heights around 70,000 feet. That difference was not just technical. It changed what an observer could reasonably expect. A fast light seen near the horizon might be treated as a star, a meteor, a balloon, or an aircraft. A light that stayed visible after sunset seemed much higher than known traffic, and changed brightness without showing a familiar silhouette could defeat those categories. Blue Book received exactly the kind of report generated when an object is real, but the correct category is unavailable to the witness. The Air Force had been collecting UFO reports under a sequence of projects since the late 1940s. Project Blue Book began in 1952 and eventually accumulated 12,618 reports before closing in 1969. According to the Air Force and the National Archives, 701 remained classified as unidentified. Blue Book was therefore much broader than a catalog of strange lights over secret bases. It accepted reports from civilians, pilots, radar operators, and military personnel, then tried to classify them with whatever data investigators could obtain. Those totals are important because they prevent an easy mistake. The CIA spy plane explanation did not replace Blue Book. It became one identifiable source inside a much larger reporting system that also included stars, planets, balloons, conventional aircraft, weather effects, hoaxes, and cases that remained unresolved. The U-2 wave also did not begin with the famous 1960 shootdown of Francis Gary Powers. By May 1, 1960, when Powers was brought down over the Soviet Union, high-altitude reconnaissance had been operating for years. The public crisis made the U-2 internationally famous, but many earlier domestic observers had seen its effects without knowing what it was. This creates a useful chronological check. If a reported sighting occurred before U-2 testing began, the U-2 cannot explain it. If it occurred far from a flight path or at a time when the logs show no relevant mission, that explanation weakens. If the description involves an object close to the ground, physical traces, or behavior incompatible with distant high-altitude aircraft, the match becomes harder. A classified program is an explanation only when the details line up. That sounds obvious, but it is the standard that keeps this subject from collapsing into two opposite shortcuts. One shortcut treats secrecy as proof that every mystery hides extraordinary technology. The other treats the existence of secret aircraft as permission to erase every report from the same era. Neither approach uses the records carefully. The declassified CIA material gives something better, a testable mechanism with dates, altitudes, aircraft characteristics, and, most importantly, flight logs. Those flight logs are where the stories moves from plausible optics to investigative procedure. Blue Book was based at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, when investigators received a report that might match high-altitude reconnaissance. The CIA history says they regularly called the agency's project staff in Washington and checked the reported sighting against U-2 flight records. The process linked two bureaucracies that were not equally visible to the public. Wright-Patterson held the UFO case file. Washington held the sensitive reconnaissance information needed to test one possible answer. A witness could send a letter describing a bright object. The Air Force investigator could compare the time and location with a classified mission. If the two matched, the private case could be effectively solved. The reply to the witness still could not say, "You saw a CIA reconnaissance aircraft." The CIA account says investigators then tried to explain such sightings by linking them publicly to natural phenomena. Gerald Haynes, in a separate CIA history of the agency's role in UFO studies, was more explicit. He wrote that Blue Book personnel aware of the secret flights attributed many sightings to U-2s, but were careful not to reveal the true cause. Haynes said the Air Force made misleading and deceptive statements to protect an extremely sensitive national security program. That is a significant admission, but it needs to be read precisely. It documents deception about at least some explanations. It does not document a universal policy of hiding extraterrestrial craft. The records describe a familiar intelligence problem. The government possessed the answer to a civilian observation, but the answer itself was classified. There is a small bureaucratic scene hidden inside that process. A Blue Book officer in Ohio has a report on his desk. A phone call goes to Washington. Someone inside the reconnaissance program checks a mission log that the witness will never see. The dates match. The investigator can close the practical question, yet the public file cannot contain the real reason. That is how a genuine unidentified experience can survive in public memory after it has stopped being unidentified inside government. It also explains why later researchers can encounter contradictions in the record. A public explanation may look weak because it was never intended to reveal the classified cause. A witness may reasonably reject an explanation such as ice crystals or temperature inversion if the thing actually seen was an aircraft. Decades later, the weak public explanation can be read as evidence that officials had no answer, when in some cases the problem was that they had an answer they could not disclose. The system therefore produced two records at once, the observable event and the sanitized explanation. This is the strongest part of the CIA case because it includes a mechanism for verification. The claim is not simply that secret airplanes existed somewhere in Nevada. It says 7 investigators were checking individual reports against flight activity. The next question is harder. How many reports did that process really account for? The phrase that made this history famous is short. U-2 and later OXCART flights accounted for more than one-half of all UFO reports during the late 1950s and most of the 1960s. That is the CIA History Staff's wording. The U.S. Naval History and Heritage Command reproduces the same passage. CIA public history pages have repeated it for years. Pursuit Release ZO3, cleared on June 12, 2026, now lists the monograph as CIA UAP ZO03 in a government release specifically organized around UAP records. But the number deserves the same scrutiny as any other extraordinary statistic. On the printed page, the statement is supported by a note identifying information supplied by James Cunningham to historian Donald Welzenbach. Gerald Haynes later described the figure as an estimate from CIA officials who had worked on the U-2 and OXCART programs. His wording says that over half of UFO reports from the late 1950s through the 1960s were accounted for by manned reconnaissance flights over the United States. That source trail is meaningful. It tells us the estimate came from inside the reconnaissance world and was accepted by later CIA historians. It is also different from finding a published Blue Book spreadsheet in which every case is coded and 50.1% can be independently recalculated. The official record supports the claim as a later estimate by people connected to the program and as a conclusion adopted by CIA historians. The pages we have do not present a case-by-case statistical appendix behind the percentage. So the responsible use of more than half is neither to dismiss it nor to inflate it. The estimate becomes plausible when placed beside the operating environment. U-2. Flights introduced objects above 60,000 feet into a sky where ordinary observers did not expect manned aircraft. Blue Book investigators had access to the secret schedules. The CIA says those checks eliminated a majority of reports in the relevant set. Haynes independently describes many sightings being attributed to U-2 flights and connects the resulting secrecy to later cover-up suspicions. At the same time, the Air Force's final Blue Book OAK total contains 701 identified reports out of 12,618. The CIA estimate does not convert those 701 into U-2s. It does not tell us that half of every UFO report in every country or every year was a reconnaissance aircraft. The language is tied to a period and to programs whose operations had specific locations and schedules. This is the main turn in the evidence. The most interesting lesson is not that a secret aircraft dissolved UFOs. The lesson is that a secret program can manufacture a statistical distortion in public reporting. It creates sightings because people see unfamiliar hardware. It creates poor explanations because aid officials cannot reveal the hardware. It creates future suspicion because the poor explanations survive longer than the classification. Then, years later, declassification shows that some witnesses really did see something the government denied or disguised. Without proving the larger interpretation, the witnesses may have attached to it. That pattern is more useful than a blanket answer because it tells us what evidence should exist when classified technology is the cause. engineering capability, operating dates, geographic overlap, flight records, and an institutional reason for withholding the explanation. The U-2 provides all five. OXCART made the same problem faster, higher, and stranger. The CIA began looking for a U-2 successor because altitude alone was no longer enough protection. Lockheed received the OXCART contract in 1959. The aircraft that emerged, the A-12, was designed for sustained flight above 80,000 feet at more than 3 times the speed of sound. CIA museum material gives its mature performance as Mach 3.2 at 90,000 feet. 15 A-12 aircraft were built for the program, including specialized variants. On April 30, 1962, an A-12 made its first official test flight at Groom Lake. Earlier taxi and brief airborne events were part of the shakedown, but April 30 is the official flight date used in CIA program histories. 3 years later, after hundreds of hours of risky development, the CIA considered the aircraft operational. By then, the reconnaissance program had moved beyond the visual oddity of a silver airplane flying unusually high. OXCART combined extreme altitude, extreme speed, unusual shape, new materials, and a test. Program hidden at one of the most secret airfields in the United States. A witness did not need to see the whole aircraft to encounter something difficult to classify. At 90,000 feet, the A-12 was roughly 70,000 above a typical 20,000-foot airliner. At Mach 3.2, it could cross a large section of sky far faster than conventional traffic. Its operational requirements also produced unusual takeoff, tanker, training, and support activity around restricted areas. Some of those signatures could be visible even when the mission purpose was not. This does not mean every fast light of the 1960s was OXCART. In fact, the CIA's own history says OXCART saw limited operational use before program ended in 1968. The A-12 flew operational missions over Southeast Asia in 1967 and over North Korea in 1968, while much of its earlier life consisted of development and training. That timeline helps separate the programs. U-2 activity can plausibly account for sightings beginning in the mid-1950s. OXCART cannot explain a 1957 report because the A-12 did not yet exist as a flying aircraft. A 1963 sighting near a test corridor has a different evidentiary context from a 1968 sighting halfway around the world. 9. The declassified record gives the investigator a clock. It also gives the subject a second wave of secrecy. The U-2 became publicly known after the Powers incident in 1960, but that did not end classified high-altitude reconnaissance. While the world learned the name U-2, the CIA was already developing a successor whose performance was even harder to imagine. That overlap matters for UFO history. Public knowledge catches up to one secret system, just as another system changes the upper limits of what is physically in the sky. There is a temptation to tell this as a neat progression from U-2 to OXCART to explanation. The record is messier. Some sightings match the mechanism, some reports remained unidentified. Some public explanations were intentionally incomplete. And by the time OXCART was operational, satellites were also changing the intelligence mission that had created these aircraft in the first place.
Yeah.
The hardware moved on. The reporting culture it helped shape did not. By 1969, Project Blue Book closed. By 1974, the period covered by the CIA reconnaissance history reached its end. Those dates are easy to blend together, but they refer to different records. The 20-year span in the title of the CIA's monograph, 1954 to 1974, is the history of the U-2 and OXCART reconnaissance programs. It is not a claim that Blue Book kept checking UFO reports until 1974. The Air Force terminated Blue Book on December 17, 1969. That boundary is useful because it forces the evidence to stay inside its proper frame. The decision to end Blue Book followed the University of Colorado study led by Edward Condon, a National Academy of Sciences review, earlier Air Force studies, and the service's own experience with 2 decades of reports. The Air Force concluded that no UFO investigated by Blue Book showed a threat to national security, that it had found no evidence of technology beyond contemporary scientific knowledge, and that it had found no evidence that unidentified cases were extraterrestrial vehicles. Those are the official Blue Book's conclusions preserved by the National Archives and the Air Force. They coexist with 701 cases that remained listed as unidentified. There is no contradiction in that. Unidentified does not automatically mean extraordinary. It can mean the available information was insufficient for a confident conventional identification. The same caution works in the opposite direction. A government statement that many reports were U-2s does not identify a specific case unless the timing and other evidence support the match. This is where the documentary has to resist its own most attractive explanation. Secret reconnaissance clearly generated UFO reports. The CIA says flight log check resolved a majority in the relevant context. The agency also acknowledges that the need to protect those programs led to misleading public statements. All of that strengthens a secrecy-based explanation for many Cold War sightings. Yet the existence of that mechanism cannot be used as a solvent poured over the rest of the archive. A case with no matching flight activity is still a separate problem. A case involving multiple sensor types, close-range observations, or physical effects demands evidence suited to those details. A report from a year before the aircraft flew cannot be retrofitted to the aircraft. A residual blue book case cannot be relabeled just because a secret program operated somewhere during the same decade. The proper standard is correspondence, not atmosphere. That may feel less satisfying than choosing one grand answer, but it produces a stronger historical result. Declassification gives us one class of solved mystery, and at the same time, teaches us how easy it is to overextend a solution once we finally have it. The classified aircraft explanation has unusual strength because it can be checked against logs. Where the logs fit, the explanation gains weight. Where they do not, the explanation loses weight. That is how a documentary about secrecy avoids becoming another form of speculation. It also changes how the old witnesses should be treated. Some of them were told explanations that officials knew were incomplete. Their skepticism toward those explanations was not automatically irrational. The later documents show why mistrust could grow even when the hidden cause was conventional human technology. Secrecy solved reports privately while preserving mystery publicly. The 2026 Pursue release makes this old history newly visible in a modern UAP archive, but the document itself was written decades earlier. Pedlow and Velzenbach's monograph was published by the CIA history staff in 1998 based on a classified original from 1992. The new release changes access and context more than it changes the underlying historical claim. It places the monograph beside other UAP-related government records, which makes the old reconnaissance passage easier to find and compare. That is worth keeping straight because declassification dates can create false novelty. A document released or republished today may describe an assessment made years ago. The evidence should be dated by what it records, who wrote it, and what source chain supports it. For Unsealed Sky, that is the line we will keep. When a classified aircraft is proposed as the explanation for a UFO report, the first questions are practical. Did the system exist at that date? Could it produce the observed speed, altitude, light, or shape? Was it operating in the relevant area? Do logs, test histories, or later official records connect it to the report? Is the explanation specific enough to be falsified? 11. The U-2 case passes that test unusually well. We have aircraft performance far above normal 1950s aviation, a documented optical mechanism involving sunlight at high altitude, an official statement that Blue Book investigators checked reports against CIA logs, and later CIA histories that estimate reconnaissance flights accounted for more than half of reports in key years. OXCART extends the pattern with a system capable of Mach 3.2 at 90,000 feet, first officially flown in 1962 and operational later in the decade. What we do not have is permission to use those facts to erase every unresolved report. Blue Book still recorded 12,618 sightings and left 701 unidentified. Some cases may have been unresolved because information was poor. Some may have lacked the classified explanation available in other cases. The surviving numbers do not tell us by themselves what every residual case was. The evidence is simple. A documented mechanism can explain only the cases it actually matches. Anything beyond that needs its own evidence, not borrowed certainty from a different case. A secret system can create a real observation, a false public explanation, and a durable conspiracy story in one sequence. Declassification may later reveal the system and vindicate part of the witness's complaint, while still rejecting the witness's larger conclusion. That is why evidence has to be attached to individual cases rather than to a mood about government secrecy. The U-2 and OXCART history gives us a rare control sample. We know the hardware existed, we know its performance, we know investigators checked reports against flight logs. We know the public could not always be told the real cause. That combination is strong enough to explain many reports without becoming a substitute explanation for cases the record does not match. So, If a classified aircraft can create a UFO wave, what modern system would you check first today? Put your answer in the comments and name the evidence you would want before accepting it. Subscribe to Unsealed Sky if you want the files followed that way. Document first, mechanism second, conclusion only as far as the record allows. But secret aircraft are an explanation with flight logs. The next file is harder because 1,000 hours of film analysis still produce two competing conclusions.